This video will discuss active reading. Active reading simply means being an engaged reader. I like to think of it as reading with a pencil. So you're reading with something in your hand, a writing utensil in your hand. And what that kind of forces you to do is to take notes, to remain alert, and to really be engaged with what you are reading. We like to say that all academic reading should be active reading, and that's because when you are reading an academic text, you want to make sure that you are understanding it and that you are sort of entering into the conversation that's taking place on the in the text. So it's very easy to read actively, and I would suggest that you try this instead of highlighting. So if you're a big fan of highlighting your texts, this can be a little bit more useful. When you jot stuff down, you tend to retain it a little better than simply just running a highlighter over it. So let's get started. Step 1 is often called previewing the text. And previewing the text simply means just taking a look at it before you even get started with reading it. So what you want to do is think about, first of all, you might want to think about something like, all right, what class is this for? Is it history class? Is it philosophy class? Is it English class? Am I reading fiction, nonfiction, something historical? Am I reading a textbook, right? And each of those different types of materials will involve a different approach. So, for instance, if you're reading something that is in a textbook, like a textbook chapter, you might find that there's a lot of subheadings, a lot of section titles. There might be a lot of images that you have to take in along with the text material. And so you'll want to make sure that you're getting all of that, right? The major concepts, the minor concepts, the examples. If you're reading a work of fiction, for instance, then it's a little bit different, right? You might have to think about who are the characters, how do they relate to each other, what's the setting of the piece. You might have to think about those things. So if I'm looking at this, and this is an essay by Edgar Allan Poe, even though, he's known mostly for his poetry and his short stories, we're going to look at this, which is a nonfiction essay. And so step 1 is to look at the title, The Philosophy of Composition. Okay, so we might think this obviously has to do with writing, right? Composition, and it's his ideas about it because it's the philosophy of, and so that should give us an insight into what this is going to be about. So for me, as a writer and an educator, hey, that sounds interesting, so that helps me out. Then you want to look at the author, Edgar Allan Poe. Like I had mentioned earlier, he is a pretty well-known writer, but maybe you don't know much about him. And if I have to read this entire essay about him or written by him, then I might want to pause and I might want to go, look him up. This is just previewing. I can do a quick Google search, and that's allowed, just to get a sense of who he is, who he was, what is he known for, what are his works, all of that. Where is he from? So I have the title, I have the author. I want to look at the form a little bit here, the paragraph structure, see if there's anything interesting there. We're only going to look at these first 3 paragraphs, so no need to do too much with that. So all I can see here is that some words and some names, right? And it looks like they are book titles, actually, are in italics, but also some words that aren't necessarily book titles are in italics too. That seems to be the only form-related issue here. So not much that I need to think about for now. So now I've done my previewing. And what I recommend that you do right now is you might want to just pause this video and read the first 3 paragraphs here. Read the first 3 paragraphs on the screen. And if you don't understand them, that's okay. right? I just want you to be introduced to this text a little bit. So go ahead and pause if you haven't already and read through these 3 paragraphs. Okay, so you've paused, you've read these 3 paragraphs, and now we're going to go through and do a more close reading, right? A more active reading. And often, active reading does involve reading a text more than once, especially if it's a difficult text. So this one you might find is somewhat challenging, right? Because there are some book titles here that if you aren't familiar with them, you might have to look them up. So I know, for instance, that Charles Dickens apparently wrote this book, and somebody else, right, named Godwin, I might not know who that is, wrote this book. And it doesn't seem necessarily that I need to stop right away and look these texts up if I haven't read them. But I might want to make a note to myself that I need to go back and look these up. And it might just be in the form of a question mark, right? It could just be something like that. So I'm reading along, and I might find that there is a word here that I don't know, like denouement. Okay? So you might find that that's a word that you need to look up. So you could circle that, right? Or you can underline it, or you could put a star in the margins. And if possible, just keep reading and go back maybe at the end of the page or at the end of the chapter and look up those words. If you really find that you're just not able to get past it, that it's just a block, and in this paragraph, for instance, it's mentioned twice, you might have to stop and look it up. And if you think it's something that you're not going to remember, you can even write the definition here in the margins, so that if in a couple weeks from now you have to write a paper about this essay and you've forgotten what it means, you can just look, oh, it's in my margins there. And that will usually jog your memory. So that's what you want to do in order to understand the text that you're reading, right? So you might have question marks, you might have things circled that you have to go look up later, and you might have to read things more than once. If it's a really difficult text, what you might find that you have to do is actually in the margins, in every paragraph, if it's really difficult, or in every page or chapter, you might want to just briefly summarize the work. And you could even do this on a separate piece of paper, right? And that can help you, again, if you have to go back to the piece, if you're doing it for homework or whatever it is. This might not necessarily be the case on a placement test, but certainly when you are doing homework, this can be useful. So you might have a separate notebook that you're doing all that in. If it's something really, if you can just jot down a word or two, a brief phrase that will jog your memory of what that section is about, that's even more ideal. So, you could do that in the margins then. So that's what you need in order to really understand a text as you're reading it. And so that's one part of active reading. Another part is that, how I said to be engaged, enter into the conversation that is taking place on the text. And you do that by responding, right? And maybe not necessarily for everybody in a text like this, but let's say you're really passionate about the environment and you're reading an article about global warming that's really speaking to you, right? It's a new idea and you're really impressed with it. So there, what you could do is you could simply star an idea to remember to come back to it, and that's my stylus created star, so it's a little wonky. Or you could just make a note, right? Yes, that is exactly what I meant. Exactly the way I think. Or, maybe you disagree and you could have no, or, big important point. Just whatever you need to make it clear to your future self. Always think about your future self coming back to this piece and wanting to use it in a paper or to build off of the ideas, and what do you need in order to do that? So active reading, acting or reading with a pencil, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, it's a little bit more than just sitting there while you're reading. And reading actively is a very important skill that hopefully you will find quite useful in your academic pursuits.